In this presentation, I am going to go over some basics of qualitative data collection as well as qualitative sampling strategies. So this presentation, I'm drawing from the data collection chapter that you had a few weeks ago when we discussed quantitative data collection. There were some pieces in there that I think are very applicable to this discussion about qualitative data collection, as well as I'm going to be drawing from the Merriam chapters that you were assigned this week, and also giving you some tips from my own experience doing qualitative research and qualitative data collection. So, how might you go about collecting data for a qualitative study? So there are four main sources of data that people typically draw from for qualitative research. So first of all, probably the one that comes to mind for most of you, and the focus of the second Merriam chapter at least, is interviews. So having conversations with participants in your study and gathering data directly from single person interviews. Another form, similarly, is focus groups, and I will discuss the distinction between interviews and focus groups later in this presentation. So focus groups essentially collecting data from a group of participants in your study. Observations. So observations would be going to a specific setting and observing your participants or observing a phenomena in its natural setting. So again, I'll get into some specifics, but perhaps an observation study might be going to the union and observing how students from different racial backgrounds interact with one another and where they sit and how they seem to be interacting with people of different and or same races and ethnicities. That's maybe an observational study that you could do. And then finally, documents. So documents can be all different sorts of forms of physical or written or visual data that you collect from secondary sources or primary sources. So perhaps meeting minutes from faculty meetings or yearbooks or what have you. I'll go through some specific examples of documents later in this presentation, but those four sources are commonly used to collect data as part of qualitative studies. And something that's really important to emphasize is that many qualitative studies draw from all of these different sources or several of these different sources of data to really develop a rich understanding of the phenomena or questions of interest. So you do not need to necessarily say this study is going to only rely on focus group data, or this study will only rely on observational data. Oftentimes, qualitative research will draw from several different data sources. So if you're going to be doing a qualitative study and you're going to be proposing a qualitative study for your action research project, maybe think about how you could draw from several of these different sources of data to study the phenomena and questions that you're interested in. Okay, so generally interviews, when you go to do an interview, you can do it in person or over the telephone or over the computer. And so in any case, it's really important to develop trust and rapport with the people who are participating in that interview with you. And so interviews can actually be either quantitative or qualitative, right? So what would a quantitative interview look like? Essentially, you would have a standardized set of questions that were all closed-ended. So the respondents would have to pick the response from the options that you gave to them, and you wouldn't give them the opportunity to really expand on their thoughts. They would have to pre-select from the options that you gave to them. For instance, the Harris poll, the Intercollegiate Athletics Harris poll that I gave as an in-class example, would be an example of a quantitative interview. So they were all closed-ended questions. So it looks very much like a questionnaire, but the interviewer is reading questions to the interviewees, recording their answers, and moving on. So it's very much like a physical survey or a quantitative survey instrument that the participant fills out themselves, but for whatever reason, the choice is made to administer it in person. Qualitative interviews, on the other hand, are based on open-ended questions, right? And so Merriam explained that there are three major types of qualitative interviews. So there are structured qualitative interviews, and those are open-ended questions, but questions are asked in the exact order for every single participant. The wording can't be changed, and it's very much as though the interviewer goes through the exact same questions for every single participant in the study. It's very highly structured. So a semi-structured interview, or the interview guide approach, is more structured than just an informal conversation, and it does include a protocol that has open-ended questions listed, but the questions can be asked in any order, and the interviewer can kind of change direction depending on how the participant is responding to their starting questions, and the wording can be changed by the interviewer depending on how, again, the participant is responding to the prompts. And then finally, there can be sort of what's called an unstructured or an informal conversational interview, which is very spontaneous and loosely structured. There's really no interview protocol used. At least in my case, though, it's tough to have a completely unstructured conversational interview because it's sometimes hard to keep track of and analyze themes that are cutting across your subjects, and it's really hard sometimes to stay on track as an interviewer and keep your subject or your participants on course with what you're looking for. An important thing to know or to think about when you're designing your qualitative interviews is that you kind of have this trade-off between flexibility and spontaneity, which comes with unstructured interviews, with the quality of your data and the ease of your analysis in the future. Typically, most of the interviews that I have participated in, study-wise, have been semi-structured in nature. And the important thing to know related to that, too, is that probes are often used as part of semi-structured and unstructured interviews as a technique to reach clarity and gain more information about the topic at hand. And so standard probes, and Miriam talked about this in her chapter. I think it's pretty straightforward and nice that she talked about. But the nice thing about semi-structured interviews is that you can add in these probes like anything else or any other reason or what do you mean, and kind of help to get additional information that maybe won't be totally come out if you're just using a totally structured protocol, a totally structured design. So usually I think it's best to go with, if you're going to use interviews, go with a semi-structured approach. So have questions formulated at hand and you're ready with the main key points that you want to hit as an interviewer, keeping yourself organized, but don't lock yourself into saying, okay, these are the things that I'm going to ask and that's it, and I'm not going to let the participant sort of guide the process. So typically my preference is to go with semi-structured interview formats. In terms of constructing the interview questions themselves, as with your research question, you want to frame your interview questions to avoid a one-word response. Not just yes or no, but any kind of one-word response. What you really want from your participants is a lot of just talking and information and let them kind of go to town, right? Also, in addition to avoiding yes-no questions, which is the fourth point up here on this slide, you want to avoid kind of using academic jargon and confusing terminology that your participants might not totally understand. You, of course, definitely, again, want to avoid leading questions where the answer is embedded in the questions, or that you're sort of making a qualitative judgment about how the person will respond within your question. You want to try to avoid, along the same lines, interpretive questions. So you want to avoid putting words in the subject's mouth. After they respond, you don't want to say, so what you're saying is, you want to just let them respond in whatever way they feel as though is accurate or adequate to represent their own experiences. Again, avoid fact-no question or yes-no questions. Don't impose word limits. This is more of, especially when you're collecting qualitative data in a written survey. So don't say, tell me what you like about Arizona State in 20 words or less. Putting word limits or putting time limits on people is restricting the data that you're going to be able to collect. And so the idea behind qualitative research is to develop a really deep, rich understanding of a phenomena, right? And so you don't want to impose some sort of limit on that phenomena. If you want that kind of design, you probably should be thinking about maybe more of a positivist or a quantitative design. So don't impose word limits or any other type of limit on your participant. So good qualitative interview questions do also take practice and thought behind constructing them. And so that's often why, too, I like to use semi-structured interviews instead of totally unstructured ones, because at least you have in front of you on paper some well thought out, well constructed qualitative questions. And so especially when you're starting out as a new researcher, it's nice to have a good set of questions in front of you that you can always refer back to. So oftentimes those will start out with what, how, or why. Often another good way to start a qualitative interview is to say, tell me about this. Tell me about your experiences as a first-year college student at ASU. Tell me about your experiences as an intercollegiate athlete at ASU. Tell me about your experience as blah, blah, blah. It's a good way to start out your conversation with someone. Another good type of qualitative questions are the most important type of questions. So what do you think are the most important problems facing higher education? Or what do you find most satisfying about your work as a faculty member at ASU? Oftentimes, those questions get people talking and get people thinking about what you're interested in. But of course, whatever your research question is, that's the way that you should construct and frame your qualitative interview questions. And a good strategy is also to pilot your interview protocol with a friend or colleague before you actually administer it, to see whether or not the questions that you're asking are garnering the kinds of rich, deep responses that you're looking for. So I'm going to give you an example of an interview protocol from a qualitative study on the next slide. So the phenomenological study that was published by Iwamoto et al. That was interested in looking at the meaning of rap music for ethnically diverse Midwestern college students had an interview protocol constructed of 5 questions. So first of all, here are their research questions up on the slide. So they wanted to investigate 3 main questions. And again, this is a phenomenological study. So they were really interested in the meaning ascribed to rap music, as well as the context in which students experience rap music and how rap music might be used to deal with everyday stressors. So they didn't go right up ahead, and this was not their interview protocol. Instead, their interview protocol looked like this. So first, they began their interview with a question about introducing the idea of hip-hop and rap music and getting at students' start of their experience with hip-hop and rap music. So really it primes the interview participant to really start thinking about their foundational experiences with hip-hop and rap music. And so then, after that was the first interview question that the interviewers asked, and think about it, when did you first start listening to hip-hop rap music? So that could be a pretty short answer, right? So back in 2nd grade. But really then, the second question in the interview protocol got the participants to expand on that idea and expand on that initial experience. So what was the ad experience like, and what does hip-hop mean to you? So actually, I think that this is problematic. This question here is double-barreled, right? Question number 2. So what was that experience like? I would have had just what was that experience like as the second question, and then as the third question, what does hip-hop mean to you? But they embedded them together into one question. But then the next step was to have the interview participant reflect on their favorite artists. Again, who are your favorite artists could be a really short answer, right? But note that they included, as well as asking about the favorite artist, please describe. So elaborate on your favorite artists. Maybe why are they your favorite artists? So that conversation can keep going from this sort of beginning structure in terms of the follow-up probes that the researchers used. And then they asked the question 4 and 5 map sort of onto the last research question. So they asked, first of all, about kind of the benefits or gains that the students got from listening to hip-hop. And then the 5th research question was more about sort of the negative aspects of hip-hop. So they balanced that out. So they wanted, with the 4th question, to get some of the benefits or the positive experiences that came from listening to hip-hop. And then in the 5th interview question, they asked about the negative experiences with hip-hop. And so you can see this interview protocol is only 5 questions, right? So these are semi-structured interviews. But with these just 5 questions, that usually translates onto at least half an hour's worth of data. You usually don't, if you're going to construct a semi-structured interview protocol, you really want between 5 to 7 or 8 questions. No, definitely no more than 10 in terms of if they're good open-ended questions, because 5 questions here will probably on average result in about a half-hour conversation and even longer. It could even go to an hour with 5 questions. So really the idea though is to construct questions that will get at your research questions, map nicely onto your research questions, but also be able to let the participants really talk and really just kind of go to town on the subject area that you're interested in. So that's an example there. And again, we'll go through in class we'll practice constructing interview protocols using your action research proposal ideas for those of you who have qualitative ideas and want to use interviews as your approach. Some other tips for conducting effective interviews. So this is not a normal conversation. Your interview participant should really do most of the talking. Don't interrupt them. Don't say, interrupt with say, yes, I see, etc. So especially if you're going to be recording your interview data, you want to get really good, long, direct quotes. And if you keep interrupting them, giving a direct quote is a little bit difficult because you keep interrupting them. So you want to let them just keep going. And sometimes it's hard because this is not a normal conversation. And we're used to normal conversations and engaging and encouraging people in conversation and also letting your own viewpoint come through. But in this case, no, your participant should do most of the talking. And also, so this is also hard, you want to give your participant time to think and respond. Don't even interrupt. Try not to interrupt as much as possible. And there might be some awkward silences and pauses. You want to give them, though, time to think and respond. And sometimes they'll pause. And you want to make sure they're not just thinking and they want to continue talking before you interrupt and ask your next question. So you really want to go at this in a very sort of slow, moderated pace to let them have time to think and reflect on what you're asking. Again, probes and follow-up questions are super helpful. So anything else? Any other reason? What do you mean? Can you tell me more about your thinking on that? Why do you feel that way? Follow-up questions will help to really elicit deep information about what you're interested in studying. Something also to note, problem informants is the sort of researchy term for your participants who really don't give you good data. It's inevitable. Some people are, for whatever reason, kind of more introverted or don't really aren't interested enough or knowledgeable enough about the phenomena at hand that they're really not going to give you great data, really expansive data. So that will happen. Even the sort of most master interviewers encounter people who really just aren't good participants in research studies. And so don't feel as though you failed, but this is actually the reason why it's good to have several different interviewees in an interview study, because you want to collect a wide range of data and be able to sort of supplement those who might be problem informants and not give you good, substantial responses. So in terms of identifying the exact perfect number of people to interview, so the larger idea is that you should try to reach what's called saturation in your data. And so if you're only relying on interviews, so what you want to do is have kind of a baseline idea of participants. So maybe, like 5, 6 people that you're going to interview. However, if you keep getting new responses and totally different patterns in what people are telling you, depending on who you're interviewing, what you want to do is keep interviewing people until you reach a point where you feel like theoretically you've got a really good understanding of your topic. And so that's the thing about qualitative research. It is a flexible design in that you should propose kind of an overall idea of what you want to do, but you need to be flexible as a qualitative researcher to allow your design to evolve with what you're finding. And so maybe your interview protocol even will change midway or partway through your study. If the questions you're asking aren't really getting responses that map onto what you're looking for, maybe you'll have to revise your protocol. So the idea behind qualitative research designs is that they're flexible enough that you can kind of follow what your data are telling you rather than having this sort of narrow, rigid approach to your study design. Okay, so I've interviewed 8 people. That's what I said I was going to do to start with, and so now I'm done. No, what you need to be doing is analyzing your data and understanding, okay, so do I feel like I really do have a good understanding of my research questions, or do I need to keep interviewing people or keep collecting more data? That idea is called saturation. So when you reach saturation is the idea that then you're done with your qualitative research. So focus groups are another way that you can collect qualitative data. And so focus groups are essentially what the idea refers to. So it's a group discussion of a particular topic of interest. So focus groups can be distinguished from group interviews. Like group interviews, or maybe there are, 5 people in the room and you ask each participant individually to respond to the same question. Focus groups are instead a group discussion rather than asking everybody in the room to individually respond to a question and go through sort of sequentially responding. It's more of a conversation. Focus groups are more of a conversation. Why not just do a focus group? Why not just interview everyone individually? So there are a lot of good reasons to use focus groups. They are especially effective when little is known about your topic. And typically, although they can be used at any stage of a research project, focus groups are most commonly used at the beginning stages. And so they're oftentimes followed up with more precise measures of larger groups, like a survey. So they're often used to develop an understanding of a phenomena and then create a survey instrument and distribute it to a larger group. So oftentimes in mixed method studies, focus groups are very useful in collecting qualitative data that can inform a quantitative phase of a study. So one of the advantages of focus groups is that the interaction that occurs among the participants can lead to more and different types of information than just doing individual or group interviews. So people can trigger one another's sort of thoughts about a phenomena of interest. So that's the nice thing about focus groups. It really encourages discussion about a topic, and it's helpful for gathering wider opinions and beliefs and attitudes about a topic and testing your assumptions. So typically, a focus group will have between 5 to 10 participants. So groups with less than 5 people tend to reveal less information, and often it can be sort of a dull conversation. But on the other hand, it's often difficult to have a good conversation with groups larger than 10 to 12. So also, if you're going to do a focus group, it's sometimes important to recruit a few extra people because oftentimes there can be no-shows, especially when it comes to college students. So I've run a couple of focus groups, and a lot of times, especially depending on the time of the semester, if it's near finals, you might not get everybody who commits to show up will show up. But again, as with interviews, the number of focus groups that you end up running depends on the amount of information that you can gather. So some studies use one focus group, and if you reach saturation from one focus group, great. But then sometimes for more complex questions, more focus groups are needed. So there's no real firm guidelines, but most studies use at least 2 and usually no more than 4 focus groups. So between 2 to 4 is the most common size in terms of in one single study, the number of focus groups that they would do. And of course, your participants should represent your population of interest. So that's who you should be selecting. So if you're interested in the perspectives of maybe students and faculty on something, typically you would do one focus group of students and one of faculty and then compare their responses. You wouldn't want to mix the 2 groups. But if you're just interested in all stakeholders' perceptions of, perhaps hybrid course design, and you really don't care about distinguishing the differences between students and faculty's views, then you would maybe just combine them into one group. But oftentimes, if you're interested in comparing perspectives, then you do one focus group of one group and then one focus group of another. In terms of moderating the focus group, it's oftentimes good that if the moderator is you as the researcher, and also you have someone else there to be taking notes or helping you. In terms of it's hard sometimes to both facilitate and record notes on a focus group. So either recording it with a tape recording or have someone there taking notes for you is often helpful if you're the researcher who is running the focus group, also moderating the focus group. So that's the basics on focus groups. Again, I'm happy to talk more about them in class. So come to class with questions if you're thinking of running a focus group for your study. And I'll put a supplemental article about focus groups on Blackboard too in the supplemental section in case this is actually the way that you're planning to collect data and you want to read more about focus groups. Another way you can collect qualitative data is through observations. So essentially an observation is when, as a researcher, you observe participants in a natural or structured environment. So why observe people? Why not just interview people about their behaviors? So of course, the thing is that what people say they are doing or what their values are or what their behaviors are not always what they actually do in practice. And so observations give you an understanding of how people actually behave in a natural setting. So maybe when you ask people about how they interact with people of opposite races or ethnicities, they might say, sort of, okay, so the socially acceptable answer is that I have lots of friends who are, from a different race. However, when you actually observe them in practice, maybe that socially acceptable sort of response isn't actually how they behave necessarily, or whatever. So that's why observation can be interesting, useful, or kind of help us to understand the way that actually phenomena occur in sort of a natural setting. As a qualitative observer, you could be a complete participant, so a full member of a group, and not even tell people that you are a researcher, and they'll think that you're just there participating along with them, and you're just like one of them. So that's what's called an observer as a complete participant. A participant as observer, the participants know that you are a researcher, but you spend a lot of time sort of with them, and you kind of immerse yourself in their practice or what's going on. And the reverse situation, or kind of a little bit different, more removed role, would be observer as participant. So people know that you're a researcher, and you sort of spend a limited amount of time actually participating with them, but more of your time you spend sort of outside the group observing what they're doing. And then a complete observer would be when you observe just from the outside. You maybe sit again in the Memorial Union. You don't interact with your participants, but you also don't tell them that you're conducting the study. A really nice participant as observer study, I'll put it up on Blackboard in the supplemental section, but it was done by this researcher at Miami University in Ohio. His name's Peter Magolda. And what he did was he went on a campus tour, and he, with the other prospective students who were visiting campus and their parents, he went on a campus tour, and observed how the tour guide explained and described the university campus, and also how the other tour participants, so the prospective students and their parents, how they reacted to the way that the tour guide was presenting the campus. So interesting observational study would be campus tours, going on a campus tour. And he served as a participant, as observer. They knew that he was a researcher and he was going on a tour to do research on campus tours. But he participated just alongside everybody else. So he walked on the tour, and, he did everything that the tour guide asked the rest of the tour participants to do. So lots of different interesting studies you can do using observational techniques. Another source of qualitative data can be from documents. And so documents can encompass both personal documents, so that people write or record for their own private purposes, or official documents, so maybe newspapers, annual reports, meeting minutes, yearbooks, what have you. Another really interesting example of a study, there was a dissertation that a friend of mine did at Ohio State, and he gave students digital cameras, disposable digital cameras, and he had them take pictures around campus of artifacts or places that held really strong meaning for them. And he used those documents, those pictures that the students took, as document data for his research as to identifying sort of salient places on campuses and salient experiences that students had as undergraduates. And he then also used those pictures as artifacts to encourage interviews with students reflecting about the meaning that those places had for them on campus. So photographs can definitely be a source of data, document-based data, that higher ed researchers use. Definitely yearbooks are another source. I use that in my dissertation. I also used, what are they called? Alumni alumni, I guess they're alumni, the interview or the surveys that university alumni associations send out at the 10-year or 20-year reunions, and then people send back sort of, this is what I'm doing now, and then a lot of universities compile those into a little book, an alumni book, I guess they're called, at reunions, reunion books. I use those for my dissertation too. So those were official documents that are collected by universities, but they're not collected necessarily for research purposes, but you can still use them for a study. Definitely there are a lot of dissertations and studies that use university archives as a document source for research. In terms of the way that we do sampling and qualitative research, it's a lot different than quantitative research. We're not trying to make inferences. We don't really care about generalizations. Our techniques are purposive. So actually, one of the things, just a note, a lot of times in the past, qualitative researchers have used the term convenient, doing convenient samplings. That term is considered now to be a little bit derogatory, like, hey, you're just convenient to me, so you can participate in my study. We prefer using the term purposive. So you use purposive samples rather than not being so concerned about making your sample be representative. Instead, you want to focus on cases that are conceptually important to you. So all of your interviews, documents, observations, whatever, should have some element of importance related to your research question. There can be a lot of ways that you can purposely sample, though, related to your research question. It just depends. So you could maybe select what's called maximum variation sampling. So maybe you want to select a wide range of participants or cases or documents or what have you. So you want to kind of get a wide variation. Maybe you want a homogeneous sample. So you could select homogeneous participants or cases that you really want to intensively study. Perhaps you want to select extreme cases, so you want to select the participants or cases that represent extremes on whatever dimension you're interested in studying. Maybe you want to try to identify a typical case, so the average participant or the average case within your phenomena of interest. Sometimes qualitative researchers use critical case sampling, so they're selecting participants or cases that they know are important or sort of especially informative cases or especially informative participants, critical cases. Negative case sampling are basically sometimes qualitative researchers are on the lookout for cases that might disconfirm their theory. So, hey, so this is what I think is the common or the typical case, but I also want to understand sort of the exception to the rule, what have you. Negative case sampling. And sometimes researchers just use opportunistic sampling. So as cases come about, as opportunity arises. So maybe because I'm at Arizona State, maybe I'm interested in doing a case study of business schools. Maybe because opportunistically I'm here at Arizona State, I'll select Arizona State's Carey School as one of my cases in my study of business schools, because opportunistically it's convenient to me. And then mixed purposeful sampling is basically just refers to when researchers in qualitative studies use a combination of those different sampling strategies. And so the thing to remember is that there is no one way to pick participants, to select participants to participate in your study, your qualitative study. You want to think about it purposively, though, and think about, so what's the purpose of your study, and how do you want to sample participants or cases for your research? So there are a lot of different approaches that you can use, and it's up to you as a qualitative researcher to define your sampling strategy that you think best fits the way you want to approach your topic. So those are just some basic sort of like key, aspects of qualitative research design and data collection that I think are important to highlight. Hopefully they are supplementing what you read about in the Merriam chapters as well as my prior lecture. And what we're going to do in class is definitely go through some data collection and sampling examples or scenarios in qualitative research, as well as practice interviewing, because I have a feeling that a lot of you are going to use interviewing as a technique, maybe for your action research study or for some studies that you're going to do in the future, maybe in your own practice. Interviewing is a common qualitative research data collection technique, and doing qualitative interviews are, as I said and as Miriam said, different than just having a conversation with somebody. So we'll do some practice interviewing, as well as we will workshop designs for your proposals, those of you that want to do a qualitative study. So hopefully the activities we're going to do in class will help to sort of reiterate some of these ideas around qualitative design and data collection. Again, I'll have time for you to ask me questions, so hopefully you'll come prepared with any questions you have about the topics that I presented on.